This must be a trick.
In 1943, Nazi propaganda told German soldiers they'd be tortured if captured by Americans. But when 50,000 POW arrived in Texas, they were stunned by what they saw: electric lights in every farmhouse, fresh milk, and steaks for dinner. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "This must be a trick. How did America's shocking abundance dismantle Nazi ideology faster than any weapon?" The prisoners stepped off trains expecting barbed wire and beatings. Instead, they saw ranch hands in cowboy hats unloading Red Cross parcels. Texas dust settled on Wehrmacht uniforms as they lined up for their first meal: real coffee, white bread, and beef that hadn't been stretched with sawdust. Back home, their families were surviving on 100-200 calories a day under RAF bombs. Here, the mess halls smelled of frying fat and oranges. By late 1944, Germany's scorched earth reality barely resembled the nation that had marched across Europe 4 years earlier. Decades later, historians would sift through the rubble and ration cards to reconstruct just how comprehensively German society had unraveled. What they found was a world of shadows where hunger outlasted ideology, threat, and British blockbuster bombs had turned medieval city centers into jagged moonscapes. In Cologne, only the cathedral still stood above waist height, its blackened spires pointing uselessly at Allied bombers. Munich residents slept in shifts in the subway tunnels, emerging at dawn to sweep broken glass from shop windows that no longer existed. A Berlin housewife's daily chore became collecting firewood from bombed-out buildings when she could find any structures still containing burnable timber. Food rationing descended into grim arithmetic. The official bread ration provided 950 calories per day on paper. In reality, bakeries stretched flour with sawdust and potato peels, producing loaves that crumbled like damp sand. Meat allocations dwindled to 2 thin slices of horsemeat per week. By Christmas 1944, families traded grandmother's jewelry for turnips at black markets that flourished under SS supervision. In Hamburg, people dug frozen vegetables from communal gardens with their bare hands during bombing pauses. At the front, conditions were worse. Wehrmacht supply trains now carried more propaganda leaflets than rations. A frontline soldier's iron rations, originally intended for emergencies, became standard issue: 1 can of mystery meat. At per 3 men, hardtack biscuits that shattered rifle stocks when used for kindling. Winter uniforms arrived in spring. Spring boots came as the first snow fell. Field hospitals reused bandages until cloth disintegrated, while penicillin remained a rumor from captured Allied medkits. Against this collapse, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine redoubled its efforts. Newsreels showed rose-cheeked children receiving extra rations footage, actually filmed in 1941, with actors. Radio broadcasts claimed London suffered identical deprivation, that American soldiers starved on Pacific islands. Most crucially, they repeated one core message: surrender meant instant execution. Pamphlets described imaginary torture chambers where Jewish American commandos extracted confessions with blowtorches. Soldiers believed these stories because they mirrored their own world. When a company commander near Aachen ordered troops to shoot surrendering Americans in 1944, few objected. They assumed the enemy did the same. Letters from home reinforced the nightmare, with parents warning sons that capture meant certain death. A Dresden shopkeeper wrote to his son on the Eastern Front, "Better to die clean than let the Reds or Americans take you." Surrender thus became an existential gamble. Some units fought to annihilation simply because the propaganda had closed off alternatives. When entire regiments did capitulate in the West after D-Day, they did so expecting quick executions. Instead, American MP handed out cigarettes and chocolate bars, then loaded prisoners onto unguarded trucks. This alone would have been shocking, but the greater dislocation still lay ahead. Few events better exposed the Nazi state's pathological lies than what happened next. These malnourished lice ridden prisoners, many still convinced they'd be shot at dawn, were transported not to camps, but to ports. There, they boarded Liberty ships, repurposed as prison transports, where Red Cross parcels awaited each man. The vessels themselves were revelations, freshly painted, mechanically sound, their holds converted into dormitories with triple-tier bunks. No Wehrmacht transport ever matched their condition. One prisoner from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division kept a hidden diary during the crossing. He noted seeing American crewmen throw excess food overboard rather than serve leftovers, an act so wasteful it seemed like deliberate theater to his starvation. Describing the ship's hospital, "They have machines to clean bed linens. Not one nurse asked about my party membership." By the time these ships reached America, an epistemological crisis was brewing. The Germany these men had left no longer functioned as a modern state, was a collapsing organism where basics like shoes and soap had become unobtainable luxuries. Their propaganda, hardened expectations about American weakness, now faced incontrovertible evidence to the contrary. Yet still, none were prepared for Texas. When the first prisoner trains crossed into the American interior, guards reported men pressing against windows like children. Unlike Germany's bomb-shattered landscape, here were undamaged water towers, freshly painted barns, trucks hauling produce without armed escorts. Rural electrification meant every farmhouse had lights burning after dark, something absent in Berlin since 1943. One officer repeatedly asked guards, "Where are the bomb craters?" The prisoner's physical condition made the contrast more jarring. At Camp Clark in Missouri, doctors recorded weights averaging 30 pounds below standard for European men. Dental inspections found widespread scurvy and rhabdomyolysis, is unseen in America since the 19th century. And yet these walking indictments of the Reich were about to experience something even more unimaginable. Not just adequate care, but abundance. Initial processing included delousing showers with real soap, not the eraser-sized chips Germans had used since 1942. Medics administered vitamin shots that turned urine in bright yellow, sparking rumors of poison. Fresh uniforms included new socks, an article of clothing many hadn't seen in years. Then came the mess halls. The first dinners featured foods most prisoners recognized only from propaganda films about American excess. White bread with actual butter, beef stew with discernible meat chunks, fresh apples. Some men initially refused to eat, convinced the food contained sedatives. Others gorged until vomiting under the amused watch of guards who had never known real hunger. A few wept openly at the taste of sugar in their coffee, first sweet many had consumed since France fell. This was the fulcrum moment. Every material claim Nazi ideology made about Western decadence and weakness now lay shattered before their eyes. The Americans weren't just adequately feeding their prisoners, they were doing so effortlessly to sustain a failing war. No amount of propaganda could reconcile this reality. The train platform at Le Havre in November 1944 became an arena of cognitive dissonance. Men who had overseen cattle car deportations now stood prisoner, steeling themselves for the same treatment. Each Wehrmacht and SS soldier carried a mental image of their likely transport. Freezing boxcars with bucket latrines, air raids permitting no stops for days. This was the only reality they knew, both as implementers and victims of the system. Instead, American MP marched them toward gleaming Pullman coaches with curtained windows. Steam pipes ran along the ceilings to prevent frostbite. Upholstered benches allowed prisoners to sit rather than stand pressed together like livestock. The shock registered first as suspicion. Several officers refused to board, convinced the luxury preceded execution. A Panzer crewman later wrote, "We thought they would take us out at night and shoot us where no one could hear." The train's dining car proved even more disorienting. White, jacketed attendants served roast beef sandwich, is on china plates, not the expected stale crusts or starvation rations. Coffee came in thick ceramic mugs, its aroma alone triggering memories of pre-war calves. Prisoners examined the bread with forensic suspicion, prodding its texture for hidden sawdust or substitutes. One lieutenant's letter home noted, "No worms either, just wheat flour, salt, yeast." Such simplicity now seemed exotic. As the train moved west, the view outside the windows contradicted every wartime briefing. German cities had become landscapes of broken masonry and burned-out tram tracks. Here, brick schoolhouse is stood intact beside freshly tarred roads. Grain silos showed no blast damage or anti-aircraft emplacements on their roofs. Streetlights illuminated intersections routinely, a sight absent in the Reich since Operation Gomorrah's firestorms. The railroad infrastructure alone told a story. No temporary Bailey bridges, here just steel-girdered spans, maintained to peacetime standards. The American Guards exacerbated the dissonance through casual indifference. While SS sentries would have enforced silence or beaten prisoners for glancing outside, these young GI chewed gum and played cards in the aisles. Some handed out chocolate bars without demanding work details first. A captured Luftwaffe mechanic out the window, an unthinkable waste in food deprived Europe. The act carried more persuasive power than any re-education lecture. Industrial zones along the route became impromptu propaganda. Factories hummed with multiple shifts around the clock, their parking lots filled with worker vehicles. Prisoners from armaments industries did quick calculations. The Ford River Rouge complex covered more area than whole German industrial districts, yet showed no bomb craters or flak towers. Through gritted teeth, a Krupp engineer admitted his country had underestimated American capacity by at least 300%. Rail junctions demonstrated organizational efficiency that stunned men accustomed to Germany's crumbling logistics. Switchyards operated without armed guards scrutinizing paperwork. Freight trains passed heading east, not ammunition or tanks, but refrigerated produced cars and brand new automobiles. The sight of post-war consumer goods rolling toward civilian markets, while Germany rationed typewriter ribbons, forced existential questions. Nightfall brought another confrontation with reality. Blackout regulations were clearly optional here. Farmsteads left porch lights burning, neon signs advertised diners and movie theaters. A Kriegsmarine officer recorded in his journal, New York City glowed like a fairy tale castle across the Hudson, no searchlights, no flak bursts, just light for no military purpose. The observation shook his belief in Allied desperation. Hygiene facilities on board completed the demolition of Nazi stereotypes. The train included shower cars with unlimited hot water luxuries, unavailable even in German barracks by 1944. Medics distributed toothbrushes and safety razors, items many prisoners hadn't held since 1941. When men hesitated to use the provided soap, guards demonstrated by washing their own faces. This ordinary act carried revolutionary weight. Where German doctrine treated enemy POW as subhuman, the Americans seemed intent on proving their own humanity. By journey's end, even hardened SS troops exhibited changed attitudes. Casual conversations revealed doubts about Goebbels' claims of Allied collapse. One remarked that any nation feeding prisoners this well must have staggering food surpluses at home. Others noted the complete absence of security precautions. No attempts to blindfold them from strategic sites, no censorship of their letters. The implicit message radiated more to hide because it had nothing to fear. The cattle cars of Nazi Europe had served as instruments of dehumanization and control. These American trains achieved the opposite effect, simply through normalcy. Every working signal box, each undamaged water tower testified to a fundamental truth. Reich's claims of Allied weakness weren't just exaggerated, they were inverted. The United States wasn't struggling to survive, it was barely noticing the war's impact on daily life. This realization registered most profoundly among technical personnel. Engineers saw how standard gauge rails allowed faster speeds than Germany's chaotic mix of pre-war gauges. Logistics officers noted the absence of improvised repairs on bridges and tunnels. Even the prison trains themselves carried implications. Germany, by 1944, had cannibalized passenger cars for scrap steel, while America still had enough rolling stock to spare for enemies. When the trains finally reached camps like Fort Robinson and Camp Shelby, the prisoners stepped onto platforms swept clean of snow or levees, another small astonishment. Maintenance was a choice, not an impossibility. The sight of well-fed American guards with polished boots and intact uniforms drove comparisons to their own ragged Heer units. Nothing needed to be said. The evidence mounted irely. They hadn't been conquered by savages, but by a civilization operating at a level of abundance their own nation couldn't match. The railway journey thus became the first domino in propaganda's collapse. Nazi ideology had always framed Allied mercy as weakness, American prosperity as exaggeration. Yet here was a counterargument in rivets and breadcrumbs, material proof that shocked precisely because it was mundane. By the time Red Cross parcels arrived with milk chocolate and oranges, even the most indoctrinated prisoners faced an uncomfortable question. If the enemy's prisons exceeded their homeland's living standards, what exactly had the war been for? First night in Texas, the floodlights at Camp Hearn threw sharp shadows across the parade ground, brighter than any Berlin streetlight before the blackouts. Prisoners blinked against the glare as they disembarked, their pupils still adjusted to Europe's perpetual twilight. Some shielded their eyes like miners emerging from a shaft. The camp's perimeter lights burned all night because Texas could afford the electricity. Medical processing began immediately. Army doctors noted weights averaging 112 pounds for 6-foot-men, their ribs visible through stretched skin. The dental exams revealed scurvy gums and rotted teeth conditions American physicians hadn't seen outside textbooks. When medics administered penicillin injections, Wehrmacht medics asked to examine the vials. They'd only heard rumors of this drug. In Germany, wound infections still meant amputation or death. The showers scalded at first contact. Prisoners accustomed to cold sponge baths in shared buckets now stood under relentless hot water. Soap lathered thickly in their hands, not the waxy German substitute that barely produced suds. Guards issued fresh uniforms still stiff from the factory, each set containing 2 pairs of wool socks, more than most had owned since 1940. The razor blades distributed for shaving were disposable, not the resharpened slivers German barbers reused until they snapped. A former hotel chef from Munich collapsed when assigned to kitchen duty. Walk-in refrigerators held sides of beef that would have fed a Berlin neighborhood for weeks. Electric mixers whipped real butter by the barrel. The waste protocol required discarding any food exceeding 110% of estimated NEDA regulation that left him sobbing over garbage cans full of edible bread. His letter home described watching guards dump 5 gallons of still, warm soup rather than save it for the next meal. X-ray machines in the camp hospital revealed untreated fractures from the Eastern Front. Technicians developed films in minutes using chemicals that German hospitals had exhausted by 1942. An SS trooper with a bullet still embedded in his thigh received surgery under sterile conditions his division's field clinic never achieved. The nurses wore fresh cotton gowns, each Schiffthei's sister back in Stuttgart, washed and reused her operating theater smock for months at a time. Dinner service became an exercise in cognitive dissonance. Trays bore portions calibrated to rebuild malnourished bodies. 8 ounces of roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, buttered green beans. Prisoners from elite units initially refused, convinced the meat contained sedatives or worse. Others ate until vomiting, their shrunken stomachs unable to process the richness. A Panzer officer's diary entry read, "The Americans waste more food at one meal than This isn't punishment, it's humiliation by generosity." The barracks inspection revealed further contradictions. Each wooden building contained electric lights, cast iron radiators, and flush toilets, amenities absent from German military housing since 1941. The lumber alone used for one barracks would have reconstructed 3 bombed-out homes in Dresden. Prisoners assigned to maintenance received new tools daily. Back home, mechanics shared files and hammers between entire workshops. Night brought the deepest shock. With blackout curtains optional, prisoners could read after lights out simply by the glow of perimeter lamps. A Luftwaffe pilot accustomed to navigating by moonlight wrote home, "There's enough wattage here to land a squadron. And they use it just so we don't trip going to the latrine." The contrast with his last posting, a darkened airbase where mechanics worked by shielded lanterns, left him sleepless. POW assigned to camp. Officers encountered mimeograph machines that duplicated forms without ration tickets. The typewriters had intact keys and fresh ribbons. German clerks hadn't seen such supplies since 1943. A clerk from Army Group Center counted 72 sheets of carbon paper in one drawer enough to last his former headquarters 2 years. When he accidentally tore a page, his American supervisor tossed it out without comment. Laundry facilities operated on industrial scales. Steam presses produced crisp uniforms, while German field units still traded cigarettes for needle and thread. The sight of prisoners' ragged undergarments disappearing into washers provoked unexpected reactions. Some men wept at the first clean socks they'd worn since Russia. A quartermaster sergeant noted the detergent floral scent, something no German household had smelled in years. Medical stores overflowed with supplies. Bandage rolls came pre-sterilized in paper wrappers, not the boiled rags used in Wehrmacht. Aid stations, aspirin bottles contained 100 tablet counts. German pharmacies dispensed painkillers singly by 1944. When a prisoner complained of athlete's foot, the medic handed him an entire tin of ointment. His letter home mentioned this casually, not realizing his family would barter half their food rations for such a luxury. The camp library contained more unburned books than most German towns still possessed. Prisoners could request titles banned under the Reich when signing out works that would have earned a death sentence in Germany. A university student from Hamburg spent 3 days staring at an intact encyclopedia set, unable to reconcile its presence with the bonfires of decadent literature he'd witnessed in 1938. Recreation equipment arrived by the truckload. Leather footballs piled up in storage sheds, while children back in Munich played with stuffed rags. The baseball mitts confused prisoners until guards demonstrate. These were toys for grown men, not military training devices. A former Hitler youth leader wrote his parents, "They play games with equipment better than our combat gear. Their priorities are inverted from ours." The mail service operated with surreal efficiency. Letters reached Germany in weeks, not the months of Wehrmacht field post. Prisoners received unstamped replies through the Red Cross, a logistics network Germany had long abandoned. When one man asked why Americans bothered delivering mail to enemies, the guard shrugged. "It's Thursday." The routineness of the courtesy unsettled him more than any brutality could have. By the end of their first month, even hardline nuts struggled to reconcile their indoctrination with the evidence before them. Every penicillin vial, every wasted steak, each freshly painted barracks wall testified to a simple truth: America's system worked better. The material abundance wasn't decadent, it was the predictable output of a functioning society. As one prisoner's diary concluded, "We were told they were weak, but only the strong can afford to be this generous." The propaganda war's turning point. Nazi propaganda had always framed American democracy as chaotic and fragile, a system so disorganized it could barely feed itself, let alone wage war. Then German POW arrived at the Higgins boat factory in New Orleans. Here, welders worked 3 shifts under floodlights. Their acetylene torch is cutting steel plates faster than German shipyards could unload raw materials. The assembly line spat out 700 landing craft monthly, each hull sliding into the Mississippi River before the paint dried. What shocked prisoners most wasn't the output, but who built them: women in overalls operating cranes, black crews fitting engine blocks, precisely the group's Nazi doctrine deemed incapable of complex labor. A boat engineer's diary entry read, "They use everyone, we wasted half our workforce." Ford's Willow Run plant shattered another myth nearly a mile long. Its B-24 production line moved at 27 inches per minute. Every 63 hours, a completed bomber taxied from the factory door, the pace that would have required 5 German plants working simultaneously. POW assigned to cleanup crews counted 42,000 punch clocks in the cafeteria. The plant drew more power than Cologne, yet in Germany entire cities rationed electricity to 4 hours daily. A Messerschmitt technician watched women workers installing fuel tanks and whispered, At home, we'd call this sabotage. Here it's just Tuesday. Alcoa's aluminum smelters in Tennessee burn through enough electricity daily to light every street in Munich. Prisoners saw molten metal flowing like water, while their own factories recycled beer cans for aircraft scrap. Railway sidings loaded ingots onto freight cars marked with destination stencils: Detroit, Seattle, San Diego. Proof the material wasn't rationed. A Luftwaffe mechanic noted how Americans casually tossed defective castings into reject bins that still contained more aluminum than a German workshop's annual allotment. Agricultural work details exposed deeper contradictions. POW sent to Kansas wheat farms stared at combines that devoured 30 acres in Ireland that would have required 100 men with scythes in Silesia. The machines left straw bales stacked like barracks. Back home, peasants fought over loose chaff for bedding. Grain elevators overflowed with surplus, while German bakers adulterated flour with chalk. One prisoner's letter described watching a farmer's children smear strawberry jam on store-bought white bread, then discard the crusts. His family hadn't tasted sugar beet syrup in 2 years. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant became a particular shock. Prisoners from panzer divisions expected craftsman hand-fitting parts like German factories. Instead, they found hydraulic presses stamping armored hulls every 20 minutes. Women inspectors with micrometers checked tolerance is tighter than the Reich's standards. When a former Tiger tank crewman pointed out a weld flaw, the foreman simply tagged the hull for rework. No beatings, no threats of the Eastern Front. American wastefulness wasn't negligence, it was confidence. Rationing here bore no resemblance to German deprivation. Prisoners working in canneries watched perfectly edible vegetable trimmings get shoveled into hog feed. Housewives grocery buying oranges from California, fruit most Germans only remembered from pre-war Christmas markets. Meat counters displayed cuts that would have bought black market favors from SS officers. A captured quartermaster calculated the average American butcher shop threw away more protein daily than his entire battalion received monthly. Shipyards demonstrated organizational superiority most starkly. At Newport News, Liberty ships took 42 days from keel to launch, half the time Germany needed for smaller vessels. Prisoners saw prefabricated sections arriving by rail for assembly, each marked with stencils indicating exact placement. In Hamburg, shipwrights still relied on hand measurements and ad hoc adjustments. The American system had no heroic improvisation because none was needed. Small details carried disproportionate weight. POW noticed factory floors swept clean every shift not for inspection, but efficiency. Time clocks punched workers in and out with mathematical precision, unknown in Germany's militarized labor system. Safety signs appeared in multiple languages, including German. A former Nazi labor official wrote his wife, "Here even the warning labels are considerate." Manufacturing defects were tracked statistically rather than punished individually. A prisoner watched a foreman calmly log 5 defective spark plugs without interrogating the assembly line worker. When he asked why she wasn't disciplined, the American replied, "Well, retrain everyone if it hits 6. This approach mystified men accustomed to factories where faulty parts meant Siberia. The contrast extended to commuting. Factory parking lots held thousands of worker-owned cars, no bicycle racks or cabbage-laden trams like German plants. Prisoners assigned to janitorial duties found lunch pails containing sandwiches with real meat, thermos of coffee with sugar. These weren't party elite privileges, but standard fare. A U-boat radio operator's letter home noted, "Their trash cans hold better meals than our canteens." Odd commodities proved especially jarring. Paper mills consumed entire forests for packaging, while Germany reused envelopes until they disintegrated. POW assigned to warehouse is stacked boxes of sanitary napkins, a product German women hadn't seen since 1939. The casual discarding of rubber bands and paper clips astonished men who'd last seen such items in their pre-war school supplies. Even waste managed revealed systemic trucks haul away spoiled but edible food, while their families bartered wedding rings for turnips. American sewage plants operated at capacities exceeding Berlin's pre-war infrastructure. A civil engineer from Hamburg calculated the camp's septic system handled more waste than his hometown's bomb-damaged main lines. The sum effect was cumulative and inescapable. Nazi ideology framed material abundance as weakness proof of decadence. But these factories didn't represent collapse. They signaled ruthless efficiency. Prisoners began noticing patterns, how every freight car arrived exactly when needed, how shift change is happened without speeches or roll calls, how problems were solved systematically rather than through terror. By late 1944, even SS officers whispered doubts. They'd been told democracy couldn't focus national effort, yet here was Willow Run Up, producing Germany's entire aircraft industry. Nazi propaganda claimed racial mixing caused inefficiency, yet Higgins' integrated workforce built boats faster than any Aryan shipyard. A panzer lieutenant's diary captured the crisis. Their system works better with inferior people than ours does with master races. What does that make us? Schoolhouse assignments delivered final blows. POW taught German to American children saw textbook depictions of Germany they barely recognized, medieval castles rather than bombed cities, folk costumes instead of uniforms. One teacher asked a prisoner to explain German efficiency to her class. The industrial complex outside the window made the concept impossible to articulate. Most devastating were the routine indignities. Camp guards offered coffee to elderly POW without demanding salutes. Factory foremen thanked prisoners for suggestions, a concept foreign to the Reich's chain of command. When two Luftwaffe mechanics fixed a conveyor belt, the plant manager shook their hands, an act so shocking they reported it as possible interrogation tactic. At war's end, former prisoners would carry these lessons home like contraband. They'd seen machines outpacing ideology, diversity trumping racial purity, freedom outproducing coercion. No re-education program could match the persuasive power of watching a 16-year-old girl assemble bomber engines faster than Krupp's best technicians. The factories hadn't just built weapons, they'd dismantled fascism. Later helped rebuild West Germany. They'd insist on American-style supermarkets and worker housing with hot water, not because they'd been indoctrinated, but because they'd seen alternatives that actually worked. The war's greatest psychological victory wasn't defeating Nazism, it was proving something better existed. As one former POW wrote his American Guard in 1948, "Your wastefulness saved us. Only the strong can afford to be so careless." 6. The Italian lesson in September 1943, German prisoners at Camp Concordia watched a strange transformation occur. The Italians' former Axis Alice received new uniforms with armbands labeled cooperator. Their housing shifted to better barracks with real mattresses rather than straw ticks. Most shocking was the pay increase, 80 cents per day compared to the Germans' 10. This visible reward for surrender violated every Nazi principle the captives knew. Wehrmacht soldiers reacted with fury at first. They'd fought alongside these men in North Africa, seen them die under British artillery fire. Now their one-time comrades played soccer with American guards under floodlights that would have gotten them court-martialed back home. Some Germans spat when Italians passed, invoking tradition that demanded execution for such betrayal. But the expected retaliation never came, just raised eyebrows from MP, who shrugged off the hostility as childish. The privilege is extended beyond material comforts. Italians could send uncensored letters home through Red Cross channels, an impossibility for Germans since 1941. American officers permitted family photographs, something forbidden in Wehrmacht mail since the Russian campaign began. Most disturbing to the German prisoners were the work details. Italian cooperators operated machinery at local canneries without armed guards, burning enough to buy cigarettes at the PX. A North Africa veteran noted in his diary, "They trust traders with Caterpillar tractors while we dig ditches under rifles." Moral contrasts emerged in mundane interactions. The Camp Baseball League included Italian teams whose players received athletic shoes from IMCA donations. German prisoners noticed how American guards cheered good plays regardless of nationality, an alien concept in their racial hierarchy. When an Italian pitcher injured his arm, the camp medic fitted him with a brace identical to those issued to GI. Medical equality was had separate, inferior wards for Allied troops. The canteen became ground zero for cognitive dissonance. Cooperative Italians could purchase chocolate bars and magazines. The Germans were denied. Red Cross parcels meant for all prisoners often reached Italians first, with guards turning blind eyes when they kept extras. What galled the German prisoners wasn't the inequality itself. They were accustomed to Nazi racial privileging, but the criteria. America rewarded pragmatism rather than bloodline. Geneva Convention enforcement provided deeper shocks. When Red Cross inspectors visited, Americans brought forth Italian prisoners as exemplars of compliance, clean, well-fed men with access to musical instruments and library books. German officers, accustomed to hiding atrocities during inspections, were baffled by this transparency. The staff sergeant wrote home, "They parade their kindness to traitors and expect applause, and somehow, they get it." Cultural activities highlighted the divide. Italian opera nights drew American officers in dress uniforms, their wives bringing cakes for performers. The camp band featured accordions from V-Day donations, while German musicians played home-made instruments. When a former Milan Conservatory violinist received a new bow from an American chaplain, his Luftwaffe counterpart still carved his own from salvaged chair legs. The contrast between enemy generosity and Allied deprivation became impossible to ignore. Work release programs compounded the lesson. Italian POWs staffed local farmers' markets under minimal supervision, bartering labor for fresh produce. Germans watched through wire fences as their one-time allies carried baskets of tomatoes and ears of corn back to camp, luxuries unknown in the Reich since 1942. Some Italian prisoners even dated local girls during harvest festivals, dancing under checkered tablecloths strung as decorations. This casual fraternization would have meant SS firing squads in occupied Europe. Religious freedom further undermined Nazi doctrine. The camp chapel displayed Catholic icons donated by Boston's Italian community, yet hosted Protestant services every Sunday. Jewish POW received Passover matzo from Brooklyn synagogue, something unimaginable under the Reich. A Bavarian Catholic observed American MP guarding a high holy day service and wrote, "They protect enemy Jews better than we protected German grenades." Italian prisoners described movie nights featuring Hollywood films, while Germans were restricted to censored newsreels. Permission for family correspondence meant Italian POWs relatives knew their exact location, and conditioned Wehrmacht families received only preprinted cards stating, "I am alive." When Red Crescent officials confirmed the Italians' claims, their reports circulated through German dormitories like contraband. The prisoner grapevine carried stories of Italian cooperators transitioning to civilian jobs. Some worked at New Jersey diners, others in California vineyards. A handful even married American women, a possibility so inconceivable for Germans that initial rumors were dismissed as propaganda. Then photographs arrived showing former Alpini troops in civilian clothes at Christmas parties, holding glasses of wine instead of shovels. Some German prisoners attempted to exploit the system. A group of SS infiltrators pretended to be ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers and applied for cooperator status, hoping to gather intelligence. American officers uncovered the deception not through interrogation, but by noting their avoidance of church service. It's a telltale sign of Nazi indoctrination. Rather than executing the spies as German doctrine demanded, they received standard POW rations and work assignments. The lack of retribution unnerved traditionalists more than any punishment could have. Food became the most potent symbol. Italian cooperators ate in separate mess halls where cooks prepared pasta from Red Cross flyer shipments. Their garbage cans overflowed with food. German prisoners would have fought over back homey orange peels, coffee grounds, hardening bread crusts. An Africa Corps veteran calculated one day's Italian food waste equaled his family's weekly rations. The knowledge that former allies now discarded what his children craved proved more corrosive than any re-education film. Clothing distributions underscored the inequality. While Germans received standard issue fatigues, Italian cooperators got tailored uniforms from surplus stocks. Some even wore pre-war civilian suits donated by Italian-American communities. A panzer crewman watched a former comrade try on a tweed jacket from Chicago and noted, "He looks like a professor, not a prisoner. The Americans make surrender fashionable." Prison administrators amplified the contrast deliberately. They filmed Italian parcels containing soap and canned meat, not the imaginary ones Goebbels claimed prisoners sent under duress. These newsreels screened in German compounds, their cheerful voiceovers emphasizing the choice available to all POW. The implied question hung heavier than any lecture: who truly valued human dignity? Volkssturm veterans arriving in 1945 faced the starkest reckoning. These late-war conscripts, old men, and boys entered camps where Italians had built gardens and painted murals. Their letters to families described former allies thriving under the enemy's care, while grandmothers starved in Berlin basements. 116-year-old's message captured the generational shock. "Grandfather, the Italians here eat better than you did at Verdun." Red Cross observers documented the psychological impact. German prisoners who initially scorned cooperators began asking subtle questions about eligibility. Applications for English classes tripled after news spread that Italian speakers received teaching opportunities. Even hardcore nuts is softened when shown photographs of Italian POWs children, well-fed toddlers in Naples, contrasting starkly with skeletal infants in Munich. The ultimate test came in spring 1945. As Allied armies advanced into Germany, American camp commanders offered cooperator status to all POW. Hundreds of Germans accepted, including former SS who'd once vowed never to surrender. Their rationale appeared in censored mail: if the system treated traitors perhaps the real betrayal was continuing to resist. Post-war interviews revealed the lesson's reach. Former POW remembered Italian privilege is more vividly than battlefield defeats. An ex-Luftwaffe pilot told historians, "Seeing those lazy Latins rewarded broke something in our men, not anger envy." This quiet corrosion of belief proved more damaging than any military setback. When German companies rebuilt cities using Marshall Plan aid, former POW often insisted on Italian-style labor policies. They'd seen how trust bred productivity more effectively than fear. The lesson ultimately shaped West Germany's labor loss, proof that America's moral victory extended far beyond wartime. The camp's true revelation wasn't American abundance, but its ethical foundations. Nazi doctrine claimed strength flowed from ruthlessness. The Italian cooperators demonstrated otherwise, that security could coexist with mercy. Corporal's final letter summarized the transformation: "We shot deserters. They reward them with chocolate. Now ask me again who won this war." Christmas 1943. The gift crisis. The first Christmas packages arrived at Camp Hearn on December 18, 1943. Cardboard boxes stacked higher than the guard towers. American Red Cross workers sorted them by prisoner numbers, while German POW watched through wire fences. Each package bore handwritten labels from churches in places like Ohio and Minnesota towns the prisoners had only seen as bombing targets on military maps. A young SS soldier from Dresden first assumed a trick. His fingers trembled as he peeled back brown paper to reveal items forbidden in Germany since 1939. A Hershey bar still in foil, wool gloves with no ration tags attached, a copy of Mark Twain in German. A folded note slipped out: FRH, Lich Weihnachten from the Schmidt family, Milwaukee. His hands shook holding chocolate his little sister hadn't tasted in 4 years. Commanders warned against accepting the gifts. Some prisoners burned their packages unopened, convinced the chocolate contained laxatives or the books held coded messages. A group from the 2nd Panzer Division built a bonfire of knitted scarves while singing Horst Wessel lied. But the smoke carried the scent of real wool burning, a luxury their families hadn't smelled since before Stalingrad. Their voices faltered mid-verse. POW who dared examine their gifts found improbable treasures, razor blades still coated in factory oil, leather-bound diaries with blank pages, cigarettes branded Lucky Strike, a sardonic joke to men who'd survived Russian winters. One Africa Corps veteran discovered a harmonica, just like the one he'd left in Tunisia. He played Still Nat that evening, and for the first time, guards didn't order him to stop. The food parcels broke strongest wills. Tins of Spambor 1944, expiration, dates-proof America wasn't conserving. Instant coffee crystals dissolved into beverage is richer than anything served in Berlin's finest pre-war hotels. Some prisoners hoarded sugar cubes under their bunks until aunts found them. German aunts hadn't seen refined sugar since 1940. Church groups included family photographs with their donations. Snapshots showed American children sledding, Christmas trees overloaded with ornaments, tables groaning under hams and pies. One Luftwaffe pilot stared at an image of a boy about his son's age and burned his own family's last letter describing potato peel soup. Letters written in fractured German proved most unsettling. "We pray this war ends soon so you may return to your family," read one from a Lutheran pastor in Iowa. Another included a wrinkled photo of a U.S. Army private with the note, "Our son fights in Italy. We hope he finds kindness like we show you." The thought of enemy parents wishing them well unraveled years of propaganda in a single afternoon. Christmas dinner magnified the cognitive dissonance. Camp cooks prepared meals that would have fed German battalions whole turkeys, mountains of mashed potatoes, pyramids of apples. Prisoners accustomed to sawdust bread watched guards casually discard leftover drumsticks. An engineer from Essen calculated the calories wasted could have kept his neighborhood alive through January. Some prisoners wrote thank you notes against regulations. A U-boat radioman risked punishment to express gratitude for shaving Kithi's hands had been raw from using broken glass as razors. Others secretly slipped American candy into letters home, knowing censors would confiscate anything more substantial. Red Cross workers turned blind eyes to these small rebellions. The gifts carried cultural sabotage in their generosity. Chess sets with carvings of American eagles forced prisoners to handle symbols they'd been taught to despise. Handmade quilts stitched with Texas stars warmed men who'd slept under Nazi banners. When a former Hitler youth leader received a Bible from a Tennessee church, he found Psalms marked in German and proof someone had researched his language. Skeptics scrutinized every bite for poison, only to watch guards eat identical meals. One officer secretly fed chocolate to a camp dog for 3 days before tasting it himself. The realization that Americans would waste good food testing their suspicions hit harder than any interrogation. Children's drawings included in some parcels unnerved battle, hardened veterans, colorful crayon sketches of Santa Claus and snowmen bore message, "Is like hope you like these socks my mom made." A panzer commander who'd ordered villages burned in Russia spent Christmas Eve smoothing out a child's wrinkled artwork with his knife handle. The scale of giving overwhelmed statistical understanding. Shipments included enough wool socks for every prisoner to supply a German city. A factory worker from Dortmund counted 24 identical harmonicas in his barracks alone, more than existed in his entire hometown since metal rationing began. Cultural events deepened the psychological impact. Carolers from local churches performed O Tannenbaum in accented German. Catholic priests administered communion with real wine rather than the water substitutes used in wartime Germany. A Methodist choir's rendition of Adest Fideles left prisoners whispering about how the enemy kept Latin masses when the Reich had abandoned them. Gift distribution followed no military logic. Prisoners from elite units received the same parcels as conscripted farm boys. A decorated Stuka pilot stared at his hand, knit sweater identical to one given to a barely literate Volkssturm conscript. The Americans either didn't understand hierarchies or deliberately ignored them. Both possibilities troubled him equally. Practical items carried hidden barbs, nail clippers still sharp after months of use, mocked German shortages. Leather bootlace is outlasted anything produced under Speer's war economy. A cobbler from Hamburg realized the shoe polish in his package worked better than Wehrmacht shoes from a nation supposedly crippled by Jewish capitalism. The package is provenance is told their own story. Small-town congregants had sacrificed sugar rations to include candy. Wyoming ranchers donated hand-tooled belt buckles. Pittsburgh steelworkers' unions pooled funds for gloves and scarves. This decentralized generosity contradicted Nazi claims of American heartlessness. Some prisoners experienced emotional collapses. A Waffen-SS officer wept upon opening a bundle containing Goethe's Forsyth's favorite book, long since burned in Berlin's bombings. Others traded prized possessions for additional Bibles when they found marginal notes comparing biblical passages to Nazi atrocities. The contrast with German Christmases grew unbearable. While POW received wool socks, their families unraveled old sweaters for yarn. American cookies arrived as mothers back home baked ersatz bread with ground chestnuts. One prisoner's diary entry read, "They give us coffee while our children drink roasted grain pretend tea." Medical parcels contained another quiet shock. Bandages were sterile and individually wrapped, not boiled rags. Aspirin came in bottles of 100, not the single pills doled out. American Novocaine during extractions. POW, you hadn't known painless dentistry existed anymore. Clothing donations fit perfectly because Americans had measured prisoners weeks earlier. This bureaucratic kindness seemed almost cruel. Their own quartermasters hadn't issued properly sized uniforms since 1941. A U-boat radioman held up a tailored overcoat and whispered, "They treat us like valuable men." The gift crisis peaked on New Year's Eve. Local farmers brought leftover Christmas trees for the compound. Prisoners decorated them with Red Cross string and foil from chocolate bars. Some men sang carols until lights out, their voices carrying across the Texas plains. Guards reported unexpected behaviors afterward. Hardened Nazis stopped saluting officers. Former Hitler youth leaders asked for English lessons. When censors read outgoing mail, they found fewer complaints and more descriptions of American kindness. One lieutenant wrote his wife, "I cannot explain it, but these people act as if they've already won." The package is a rival system proved as telling as their contents. Rail timetables coordinated deliveries, so no camp was missed. Truck convoys arrived on schedule, despite wartime fuel rationing. German logisticians knew what this implied. America could spare organization for enemies, while their homeland descended into chaos. By January, the ideological damage was evident. Prisoners stopped calling Americans gangsters or Jew lovers. Work details became more efficient without threats. When guards asked why, a former schoolteacher answered, "It's hard to hate someone who gives your children chocolate." Camp libraries saw surges in requests for American history books. The same men who'd burned decadent literature now read Twain and Whitman under strict surveillance. One SS officer justified it to his comrades, "One must know the enemy's mind." His hands shook, turning pages of a constitution that granted freedoms he'd helped exterminate. The ultimate surrender came in February. Prisoners began pooling gifts to send back to Germany through the Red Cross, something previously unthinkable. Knitted socks were unraveled and reworked into baby clothes. Chocolate bars disappeared into letters bound for starving nieces and nephews. In this final act of acceptance, the POW became conduits for the very generosity meant to break them. When former prisoners helped rebuild that Texas Christmas, they instituted charity drives modeled on American gift campaigns. Workplace holiday parties featured the same abundance that had once shocked them. One man became known for handing out chocolate each December, his way of repaying a debt to strangers he'd never met. The package is never mentioned politics or repentance. They simply assumed common humanity needed no justification. This quiet faith in decency left deeper marks than any re-education program. A 1945 War Department report noted the phenomenon. feeding our enemies makes converts faster than fighting them. Just 3 Christmases later, former POW would watch Berlin children receiving care packages from those same American churches. The circle closed as men who'd once refused gifts now distributed them. The lesson had taken root. Strength could dress itself in mercy, power could arrive bearing chocolate. One former prisoner told his son handing out gifts, "This is how wars really end." 8. The re-education machine. The university textbooks arrived at Camp Aliceville in wooden crates stamped, U.S. Army Education Program. Prisoners lined up to receive them, thick volumes with uncut pages and fresh ink smells absent in Germany since paper rationing began. These weren't propaganda pamphlets but standard American college texts, algebra, history, even Mark Twain novels in German translation. The paper quality alone made men hesitate before turning pages. Such smooth stock hadn't been used for civilian printing in the Reich since 1938. 40,000 POW voluntarily enrolled in courses by early 1944. Professors from nearby colleges taught in mess halls converted to classrooms. A captured U-boat engineer found himself learning calculus from a woman, an impossibility under Nazi educational policies. Her lectures on physics included references to Jewish scientists like Einstein, names banned from German textbooks since 1933. The students exchanged glances but kept writing. Knowledge here wasn't filtered through racial ideology. Uncensored newspapers became revelatory texts. New York Times issues contained detailed battle maps showing Allied advance, as Goebbels had denied. Prisoners in Kansas read about the fall of Rome, while their families still received bulletins claiming German victories in Italy. A former SS clerk compared front-line letters from his brother with Associated Press reports. Discrepancies filled 3 notebooks he later used Hollywood as evidence. Films screened in camp theaters provided subtler lessons. Unlike Nazi cinema's cardboard villains, American movies presented nuanced antagonists. Even Westerns showed Native Americans as complex characters rather than racial stereotypes. Gone with the Wind resonated unexpectedly. Its depiction of a civilization's collapse mirrored Germany's own unraveling. Prisoners debated whether Scarlett O'Hara's ruthless survival instincts made her more Nazi or more German civilian. Jewish professors lecturing on democracy delivered the most destabilizing lessons. Dr. Werner Angres, a refugee from Berlin, taught American government courses at Camp Getty in Rhode Island. Former Wehrmacht officers sat stiffly as he explained constitutional checks and balances. Subhuman Jew from Nazi propaganda, now demonstrating superior understanding of statecraft. Some prisoners initially boycotted his lectures until curiosity overcame prejudice. The camp libraries held more unburned books than most German universities. A tonnage calculation would later reveal the POW camps contained more volumes than the Nazis had destroyed during their 1933 book burnings. Prisoners could request works banned under the Reich. Heinz poetry, Freud's psychoanalysis, even Marx's economic theories. Guards shrugged when signing out these once dangerous ideas, their indifference more persuasive than any censorship. Agricultural courses proved unexpectedly popular. Lectures on hybrid corn yields and soil chemistry dazzled men from farming backgrounds. Demonstration plots outside camp fence grew vegetables larger than anything seen in Germany since before the war. A Bavarian dairy farmer wept when shown statistics on American milk production. His entire village could have lived comfortably on the output of one Wisconsin family farm. Student newspapers became laboratories for free thought. The Camp Ruston Times started as a propaganda sheet, but evolved into genuine debate forum under prisoner editorship. Articles discussed federalism versus centralized government, comparing Nazi and American systems without direct criticism. The conclusions were left to readers. Circulation tripled when officers realized these weren't trap documents, but sincere intellectual exploration. Music appreciation classes exposed cultural blind spots. Soviet symphonies and American jazz appeared alongside Bach and Beethoven. Nazi doctrine, a Jewish violinist playing Mendelssohn Band as non-Aryan music since 1936, left former Hitler Youth members fidgeting with cognitive dissonance. The beauty of the performance clashed irreconcilably with their indoctrination. Debate clubs flourished under minimal supervision. Topics like labor unions benefit national productivity would have meant concentration camps in Germany, yet American guards offered no interference. Former factory managers heard worker prisoners argue persuasively for collective bargaining, same men who'd been silent under Nazi rule now speaking freely. Their passions suggested long-suppressed opinions, not coached propaganda. Technical manuals provided silent critiques of Nazi ideology. Aircraft mechanics studied diagrams showing women installing B-17 engine components, jobs reserved for Aryan males in Germany. Textbooks described industrial quality control methods that relied on worker input rather than SS overseers. The systems worked better without coercion, a realization that unsettled former believers in racial superiority. Geography classes redrew mental maps. Pre-war German atlases had depicted the U.S. as mostly empty wilderness between coastal cities. Now prisoners studied topographic maps showing the Midwest's endless farmland, exactly the agricultural surplus feeding them daily. Climate charts explained why American winters didn't cause mass starvation like Russia's. The data made ideological claims about racial hardness seem absurd. Art programs bypassed rational defenses altogether. Watercolor classes let prisoners paint landscapes from memory images of intact villages and unburned forests they hadn't seen in years. The act of recreating pre-war beauty softened ideological rigidity in ways lectures couldn't. Some men mailed these paintings home, their implicit message clearer than any letter could risk. This was how life could be again. Film documentaries proved particularly effective. Newsreels of the Tennessee Valley Authority showed dams bringing electricity to rural areas, exactly the infrastructure Germany lacked for its own countryside. Prisoners from Bavarian farming villages watched slack-shored as American farmers used electric milking machines. Their own mothers still hand-milked cows twice daily. The films demonstrated democracy's practical benefits beyond subverted through syntax. English lessons used phrase is like due process requires, and the First Amendment protects concepts with no German equivalents. Grammar exercise is included sentences about jury trials and peaceful protests, men learning to say, I have the right to remain silent, absorbed legal principles absent in their homeland. The vocabulary of freedom became muscle memory before conscious acceptance. Economics lectures dismantled autarky myths. Graphs compared wartime production figures, American output curves rising steeply, while Germany's plateaued despite slave labor. Discussions of Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets forced reconsideration of Nazi claims about Bolshevik incompetence. A former armaments inspector drew detailed schematics comparing and Opel assembly lines, his sketches showing exactly where German industry had fallen behind. Philosophy courses reopened closed minds. Readings included Nietzsche critiques of nationalism the Nazis had suppressed, plus American pragmatists like William James. Discussion groups analyzed logical fallacies in propaganda, statements prisoners had once accepted uncritically. One session compared Goebbels' speeches with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Contrast in rhetorical quality sparked uncomfortable laughter. Psychology classes challenged racial pseudoscience. Diagrams of brain anatomy showed identical structures across ethnicities. Intelligence test results demonstrated environmental influence is trumped supposed hereditary traits. A former blonde, blue-eyed Hitler Youth medalist consistently scored below a Silesian miner's son in problem-solving exercise observations that chipped away at Aryan superiority myths. Gradually, without coercion or explicit indoctrination, the programs achieved what no military punishment could. Prisoners began questioning in private conversations first, If Americans wasted food because they had surplus, could their political system also contain overlooked strengths? If Jews proved brilliant scholars and artists, what else might Nazi doctrine have misrepresented? The change is manifested subtly: a decline in reflexive Hitler salutes, more requests for English dictionaries, longer queues at course registration tables. Guards reported hearing fewer ideological arguments in the barracks. Prisoner letters home began including phrases like "according to American economists," rather than the FHRA decrees. Industrial demonstrations delivered plants where black and white workers assembled tanks side by side, an unthinkable violation of Nazi racial laws that nonetheless produced superior machinery. They saw women engineers directing production lines that outbuilt German factories staffed by SS overseers. The sheer productive power of integrated workforce is demolished claims of Aryan industrial supremacy. Film screenings of civilian life added devastating context. Scenes of untouched American cities, fully stocked supermarkets, and children unafraid of air raids contrasted sharply with newsreel memories of Berlin's ruins. Prisoners noted small details: newspaper boys hawking extras, traffic cops whistling tunes, housewives choosing from produce varieties unavailable in Germany since 1936. The vibrancy of ordinary life argued more persuasively than any political theory. By war's end, the re-education machine had achieved remarkable results without firing a shot. Former POW returned to Germany carrying not just material goods, hybrid corn seeds, technical manuals, but something more dangerous: first-hand knowledge of a functioning alternative. They had seen that freedom wasn't chaos but produced order of a higher kind. A system that educated its enemies might, after all, be worth emulating. The evidence lay in post-war choices. Thousands of ex-POW would immigrate to America, bringing families to a country they'd first known as captives. Others helped draft West Germany's constitution, incorporating checks and balance, as they'd studied in camp classrooms. The most telling conversion came from a former SS officer who told his denazification tribunal, "I finally met the master race. They were teaching my algebra class in Kansas, 9. The Normandy revelation. The newsreels arrived at Camp Aliceville on June 8, 1944, 2 days after the first Normandy landings. Prisoners crowded into the mess hall, where a projector flickered to life, showing image no Nazi propaganda had prepared them to see. The screen filled with ships, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of vessels stretching to the horizon in mechanical precision. A former U-boat officer counted 6 different types of landing craft in the first 30 seconds, each designed for specific functions: infantry, tanks, supplies. His mental calculations came up short against the scale before him. German military doctrine had always emphasized. Prisoners heard their own news bulletins boasting about superior Tiger tanks and Me-262 Jetsalite weapons that existed in dozens. Now they watched Higgins boats disgorging thousands of standard issue Sherman tanks onto French beaches. The difference wasn't tactical, it was mathematical. One Panzer commander whispered to his adjutant, "We built perfect weapons, they built enough." The aerial footage triggered deeper shocks. Bombers flew in formations larger than most peacetime air shows. Transport planes dropped paratroopers not in small sabotage units, but division strength. A Luftwaffe mechanic recognized the engine signatures of P-47s providing close air support. Same planes had been told were inferior to German fighters. The numbers alone were incomprehensible: 11,000 aircraft supporting the landings. The entire Reichswehr had managed barely 4,000 at the war's peak. Supply operations revealed an industrial logic Germans couldn't match. POW watched bulldozers carve roads up Normandy cliffs within hours of landing. Prefab Mulberry harbors took shape where no ports existed. Cargo ships unloaded directly onto floating piers, bypassing vulnerable docks. An engineering officer from Rommel's staff sketched the systems in his diary, arrows tracing fuel pipelines laid across seabeds. His notes showed sudden crossings, out as he realized German logistics still relied on captured rail lines and horse carts. Fuel calculations turned the knife. A former Africa Corps quartermaster worked the numbers on a smuggled slip of paper. Just the D-Day landing craft burned more diesel in one crossing than his entire division had received for the 1942 El Alamein offensive. The figure for ongoing supply runs 15 zeros. 0 tons daily exceeded Germany's entire Western Front allocation. He folded the paper into tiny squares, hiding evidence of his treasonous math. Landing Beach Organization exposed cultural differences. Americans treated chaos as soluble. Bulldozers shoved aside wrecked vehicles while fresh waves rolled in. Medics sorted casualties by wound priority, not rank. Beachmasters directed traffic with the calm of factory foremen. A Prussian staff officer recognized the operational rhythm, not the rigid Prussian timetable, but something more fluid and resilient. The system absorbed losses without collapse. Weapons standardization told another story. German prisoners spotted endless ranks of identity. Their own armies had used captured French trucks, Czech rifles, Dutch uniforms. Now they witnessed American mass production's ultimate expression, complete uniformity from bootlace to radio crystals. A former Gestapo technical inspector wrote home, "Their privates have equipment better than our officers, not superior, just all the same." News bulletins highlighted details the POW alone understood. Reports of minor congestion at Omaha actually described traffic jams of tanks, exactly what German commanders had dreamed of during fuel-starved Russian winters. Captions about supply stockpiles showed ammunition dumps larger than entire Wehrmacht depots. Even the setbacks demonstrated Allied reserves. When storms wrecked temporary harbors, footage showed cargo planes making up the difference within hours. Shipyard assignments in America had already hinted at this capacity. Now prisoners saw the finished product. The LSD they'd welded in Mobile Bay disgorged entire armored columns onto French soil. Liberty ships they'd loaded in Norfolk kept the flow coming. A former U-boat radio operator turned stevedore realized with dawning horror, every ship he'd helped provision was now carrying weapons to kill his countrymen. The system's efficiency became its own atrocity. German officers conducted grim calculations in secret. One Gruppen sketched comparative charts, Allied fuel consumption versus German artillery shell production ratios, replacement aircraft built per month. The lines intersected nowhere favorable. His charts ended up burned in a trash can not from loyalty, but because guards might mistake them for escape plans. Cultural contrasts emerged in small touches. American medics carried whole-blooded luxury Germany reserved for SS hospitals. Engineers brewed coffee while laying pontoon bridges. Even the damned jeeps had ashtrays. A former Hitler youth leader noted in his journal, "They fight like it's a job, not a crusade. Maybe that's why they're winning." POW noticed psychological difference is in the footage. GI complained to the camera about rations or male delays unthinkable behavior in German newsreels. Officers joked with enlisted men during beach pauses. An SS interrogator recognized the signs. These weren't drugged or coerced troops, but men fighting with open eyes. Their casual confidence unnerved him more than fanaticism would have. The technological gap appeared in showed portable radios in every platoon equipment German companies lacked. Tanks waded ashore with waterproofing kits no German engineer had imagined necessary. A communications specialist from Army Group B counted 13 different radio frequencies mentioned in one briefing scene. His own division had shared two. Medical care delivered the harshest lesson. Field hospitals featured portable X-ray units and penicillin stocks. Amputees received prosthetics better than German factory workers could buy. A doctor from the Eastern Front watched a chest surgery performed under conditions cleaner than Berlin's Charité Hospital. His letter home omitted the comparison, knowing censors would strike it out. Logistics defeated ideology most decisively. Films showed warehouse-sized depots of spare parts items. German mechanics forged themselves from scrap. Railroad battalions laid standard. gauge track, while Wehrmacht units still struggled with Russia's broad gauge. Even garbage collection operated at levels German cities hadn't seen pre-war. One quartermaster's diary entry read, "Their trash system functions better than our ammunition trains." The numbers permeated prisoner conversations despite monitoring. Men whispered landing craft totals during work details. Guards overheard arguments about ship tonnages in the showers. A frustrated camp commander finally posted official Allied press release figures, so high they were assumed false until the newsreels confirmed them. Former believers suffered the sharpest disillusionment. A Nazi Party lecturer who had taught about American decadence now sat calculating their steel output from landing craft counts. His students noticed his sudden preference for teaching medieval history instead of current events. The change required no explanation. Practical demonstrations in camp rubbed salt in wounds. American guards used bulldozers to grade baseball fields machines German combat engineers had lacked for trench digging. Repair shops stocked replacement tires for every vehicle in camp. A former tank commander watched a sergeant casually discard a slightly frayed tow cable and wrote home, "The cable was better than any we had after 1941. The day's aftermath became its own education. Follow-up footage showed waves of fresh troops disembarking, not the exhausted remnants German news portrayed. Sherman tanks rolled off ships painted straight from Michigan factories. A panzer lieutenant counted 20 identical fuel trucks in one convoy. His division had run on captured British jerrycans. The films kept coming as Normandy became Paris. Prisoners saw unbroken bridges German sappers would have demolished, intact power plants Allied planners preserved. American efficiency wasn't destroying Europe, it was conserving it for future use. A former occupation administrator wrote his wife, "Thea not conquering, Thea inheriting." Psychological warfare officers noticed behavioral changes. Hardened Nazis stopped boasting about secret weapons. Younger prisoners asked about immigration paperwork. When new arrivals from the Battle of the Bulge described American artillery barrages, veterans just nodded, they'd seen the factories that fed those guns. Optical lenses gave the final proof. German magnifying glasses used inferior glass that yellowed with age. American newsreels projected crisp through hundreds of viewings. A former optics worker from Jena realized the truth while cleaning a projector lens. Even the Allies' spare parts were better than the Reich's best. The Normandy footage didn't just show a battle, it revealed an inverted world. Nazi propaganda had framed democracy as messy and weak. Yet here was overwhelming power generated by free men. An economics student who'd once praised autarky now calculated Liberty ship production rates. His notes included a margin scribble, "Efficiency might require freedom after all." By August 1944, newsreels showed Parisians cheering Americans with champagne. Prisoners watched without their usual sneers. The contrast between French crowds and bombed German cities was too glaring. A former propaganda company cameraman whispered to his bunkmate, "We filmed conquests, they are filming homecomings." The mathematical reality settled like sediment. German prisoners had entered camps expecting eventual rescue by wonder weapons. Now they understood no single invention could bridge this gap. A Panzer veteran's diary entry captured the collective realization, "We lost to spread sheet columns, 10. The return to ruins. The repatriation ships docked at Bremerhaven in February 1946, their decks crowded with men squinting at a coastline they barely recognized. Former POWs stepped onto piers still pocked with bomb craters, their duffels stuffed with unexpected contraband of manuals from Camp Robinson's library, carefully folded diagrams of American factory layouts. These souvenirs of captivity weighed little, but carried immense disruptive potential for a shattered nation. Germany lay broken in ways the prisoners hadn't imagined possible. Cities they'd last seen under blackout now stood skeletal in daylight, ragged curtains fluttering from bombed-out apartment blocks. The Hamburg Central Station they remembered as a bustling hub was an open shell where displaced children played in the rubble. Railway tracks ended abruptly where bridges had been, forcing ire long detours for what should have been simple journeys home. A returning artillery officer noted in his journal, the Reich, built to last 1,000 years, collapsed in 12. Letters they'd sent from American camps had been dismissed as enemy propaganda. Families assumed tales of steaks and unlimited electricity were coerced lies. Now the proof emerged from duffel bags, real coffee, unopened packs of Lucky Strikes, pre-war quality wool socks. A farmer's son from Bavaria showed his mother photographs of Texas wheat fields. She wept at the sight of undamaged barns and full silos, images more foreign to her than moon landscapes. Seeds became the first agents of change. Hans Kroll planted hybrid corn from Iowa between the ruins of his family's barn and chicken coop. Bavarian neighbors laughed at the unfamiliar yellow kernel, until his harvest yielded 3 times their traditional varieties. By 1948, former Camp Shelby prisoners had introduced the strain across southern Germany, boosting yields while others still starved. American agriculture professors received grateful letters in broken English from men they'd once guarded. Walter Holstein unpacked different cargo reams of legal notes taken during American government classes at Camp Camo. The Weimar Constitution he'd studied as a young lawyer had been weak, easily overturned. Now he drafted provisions for West Germany based on what worked: checks on executive power, an independent judiciary, protections for minority rights. His experience watching Jewish professors lecture on democracy shaped the new document's emphasis on human dignity. Colleagues who hadn't been POW objected to foreign concepts. Holstein simply showed them the agricultural yields from American-style farms. Infrastructure lessons transplanted readily. Former prisoners celebrated as Nazi achievements were inferior to rural American highways. Engineers who'd maintained camp plumbing systems insisted on proper sewage treatment plants for new housing projects. When bureaucrats complained about costs, someone would recount how Texas towns half the size had better schools and hospitals. The psychological gulf between former POW and other Germans became obvious in daily interactions. Prison camp veterans shrugged at black market prices they'd seen real abundance. When neighbors hoarded scraps of string or lumps of coal, the men from America would produce ballpoint pens or Zippo lighters from their pockets. These small items carried outsized meaning, proof that scarcity wasn't inevitable. Democratic principles encountered more resistance. Former SS officers sneered at the idea of free press and labor unions until shown production statistics from Detroit factories. A tank commander who'd served under Rommel shocked his hometown by organizing a workers' council, calmly explaining how he'd seen American efficiency thrive without coercion. His former company clerk recorded the reaction. They called him a traitor until harvest yields tripled. Children noticed difference is first. Fathers who'd been POW didn't flinch at loud noises like other veterans. They made baseball bats from scrap wood and taught kids games requiring cooperation rather than obedience. In a Darmstadt at refugee settlement, former prisoners were the only adults who could reliably calm night terrorists. They'd learned the techniques from American guards dealing with shell-shocked captives. Factories became proving grounds. Returning machinists insisted on safety rails and regular brakes luxuries. They'd witnessed increasing productivity in U.S. war plants. When foremen objected, the men would describe how Boeing's assembly lines outproduced Messerschmitts without needing armed overseers. A former U-boat engineer introduced quality control circles in a Bremen shipyard, reducing defects by 40% using methods learned in a Nebraska prison camp. Former POW gravitated toward reconstruction roles. A pilot who'd crashed over Normandy found work as a translator for U.S. Army engineers' English, polished by arguing baseball stats with guards. An Eastern Front veteran used prisoner of war camp carpentry skills to build emergency housing, improvising American-style plank frames that went up twice as fast as wore-down ideological resistance. When Marshall Plan shipments arrived, real coffee, oranges, condensed milk former prisoners were the only ones who didn't gawk. Their calm acceptance unsettled neighbors more than any political speech. A shopkeeper in Cologne remarked, "These men act like losing the war was the best thing that ever happened to us." He wasn't entirely wrong. Cultural imports followed material ones. Jazz records from Camp Concordia's library circulated in Hamburg's underground clubs. Paperback copies of Hemingway and Faulkner traded hands in Berlin basements. The books carried camp library stamps property notices that became badges of honor. Former prisoners could point to specific passages that had changed their thinking, their fingers tracing annotations made behind barbed wire. Agricultural demonstrators became local celebrities. Farmers crowded around XPO, who could operate the first tractors arriving under Marshall Plan aid. The men adjusted carburetors with confidence, their hands remembering lessons from South Dakota prison farms. When skeptical peasants asked how they knew these machines, the answer was always the same: the Americans taught me. Psychological transformations became visible over time. Former prisoners were less likely to defer automatically to authoritative, seen sergeants, question generals in U.S. Army documentaries. They voted in higher percentages during early elections, having witnessed democracy as participants rather than subjects. When local party bosses tried intimidation tactics, the men would recount how American ward politicians actually served constituents. Industrialists faced uncomfortable truths. Engineers who'd worked in Ford plants scoffed at claims of German superiority. At a Daimler-Benz board meeting in 1949, a former Count Rustin prisoner projected slides comparing American and German production methods. The grainy images showed women and black workers assembling superior aircraft, an unanswerable challenge to Nazi racial theories. Management ordered the room locked, and the presentation repeated for night shift foremen. The most profound changes were intimate. Fathers who'd expected torture in Texas instead taught their children baseball. Wives noted how husbands folded clothes American style or whistled Bing Crosby tunes while repairing roofs. Small rituals from the camps became family traditions. Sunday pancakes hung with care instead of military precision. By 1955, the former POW were becoming the establishment. Hallstein helped negotiate West Germany into NATO. Kroll's hybrid corn covered half of Bavaria's farmland. Factory reforms pioneered by camp veterans became national labor standards. The men who'd once cowered in Pullman cars, expecting execution, now chaired town councils and edited newspapers. The speed of Germany's recovery puzzled outside observers. American journalists wrote wonderingly about the economic miracle, unaware how many of its architects had learned their trade behind barbed wire. When visiting congressmen toured rebuilt factories, they were startled to be addressed in Midwester, accented English by foremen who joked about Texas heat and Michigan snow. Former guards and prisoners maintained unlikely bonds. Letters crossed the Atlantic with photographs of children named after camp commanders. Care packages marked "From your friends in Ohio" arrived in villages that had once mustered Hitler Youth troops. A GI who'd stood watch at Camp Hirn found himself welcomed like family when he visited Bavaria in 1961, the guest of honor at a harvest festival celebrating hybrid corn. The camp's ultimate legacy wasn't just material. Watching democracy function through prison fence had planted ideas no re-education program could match. When protesters marched against nuclear weapons in 1958, former POW were disproportionately represented, not because they loved America, but because they understood freedom's practical value. Their signs quoted Benjamin Franklin rather than Marx, their rhetoric shaped by civics lectures heard in Mississippi prison yards. Industrial cities where returning prisoners clustered showed distinct patterns. Dortmund adopted baseball leagues and American-style zoning. Stuttgart's factories implemented suggestion boxes and worker cafeterias. Munich rebuilt its university library with open stacks, a radical concept imported from Camp Getty's education program. The changes weren't imposed by occupiers, they were chosen by men who'd seen alternatives work. By 1963, when President Kennedy stood at the Berlin Wall, some of the loudest cheers came from middle-aged men with faint camp tattoos under their shirts. They needed no translation of "Ich bin ein Berliner." They'd learned his Boston accent listening to camp radios. Their children would grow up in a Germany built by fathers who discovered democracy first as prisoners, then as converts, finally as architects. The true measure of the camp's impact came not in statistics but in vanishing behaviors. No more whispering when mentioning America. No more automatic deference to uniforms. Refrigerators hummed in apartments that once stored potato peels. And every Christmas, in homes across the New Germany, former prisoners, still unpacked, carefully preserved, Hershey bar snow, shared with grandchildren who couldn't imagine a world without chocolate. The German POW story ends not in military defeat, but in a quiet revolution of expectations. America's containment camps became democracy's showrooms, places where autocracy's lies unraveled before hot showers and functioning telephones. Where Nazi indoctrination met intact families sending uncensored letters. Where 50,000 hungry men learned that freedom, for all its messiness, produced abundance coercion never could. These reluctant immigrants returned to husk Germany carrying hybrid seeds and hybrid ideas. They were built not with the Reich's brittle monuments, but with durable concepts from Kansas and Tennessee. When West Germany emerged from rubble stronger than the Reich ever stood, the architects knew why. They'd seen the alternative work behind barbed wire.